The times ahead will be radically different from those that we've experienced in our lifetimes. How does Ray Dalio know it? Well, because they always have been. Dalio said, "Over 50 years of global macroeconomic investing, I've learned that the most important events that surprised me did so because they never happened in my lifetime." These painful surprises led the author to study the last 500 years of history for similar situations. And it turns out that the things happening today aren't new. It has indeed happened many times before, with the ups and the downs of the Dutch, British, and US empires. And every time they did it, it was a sign of the changing world order. Dalio said, "In 1971, when I was a young clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the United States ran out of money and defaulted on its debts." That's right, the US ran out of money. How? Well, back then, gold was the money used in transactions between countries. Paper money, like the dollar, was like checks in a checkbook. It had no value other than it could be exchanged for gold, which was the real money. At the time, the United States was spending a lot more money than it was earning by writing a lot more of these paper money checks than it had gold in the bank to exchange them for. As people turned these checks into the bank for gold money, the amount of gold in the US started to dwindle. It soon became obvious that the US couldn't keep its promises for all the existing paper money, so people holding dollars rushed to exchange them before the gold ran out. Recognizing that the US was going to run out of real money, on Sunday evening, August 15th, President Nixon went on television to tell the world that the US was breaking its promise to let people exchange their dollars for gold. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it more diplomatically, without making it clear that the United States was defaulting. Nixon suspended the convertibility of dollars into gold temporarily. 31 years have passed since that temporary suspension announcement, and the suspension is still active. Dalio said, "I expected the stock market to plunge the next day, so I got on the exchange floor early to prepare. However, when the opening bell rang, the market was up, way up, and went on to rise nearly 25%. That surprised me because I never experienced a currency devaluation before. When I dug into history, I discovered that the exact same thing happened in 1933 and had the exact same effect. In 1933, paper dollars were also linked to gold, and in the same way, the US was spending more paper money checks than it had gold to exchange for them. And President Roosevelt announced on the radio that he would break the country's promise to exchange dollars for gold." In both cases, breaking the link to gold allowed the US to continue spending more than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Since there was an increase in the number of dollars without an increase in the country's wealth, the value of each dollar fell. As these new dollars entered the market without a corresponding increase in productivity, they went to buy lots of stocks, gold, and commodities, and caused their prices to rise. Dalio said, "As I started to study more history, I saw that the exact same thing happened many, many, many times before. I saw that since the beginning of time, when governments spent much more than they took in taxes and conditions got bad, they ran out of money and they needed more. So they printed more, a lot more, which made its value fall and made the prices of everything, including stocks, gold, and commodities, rise. That's when I first learned the principle that when central banks print a lot of money to relieve a crisis, the value of stocks, gold, and commodities will rise, and the value of paper money will fall." This printing of money is also what happened in 2008 to relieve the mortgage-driven debt crisis, and in 2020 to relieve the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and it almost certainly will happen in the future. Let me repeat this. It will certainly happen in the future. So I suggest you keep this principle in mind. Another principle you need to keep in mind is this. In order to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you. This principle helped Dalio to study how the Roaring Twenties bubble turned into the 1930s depression, which allowed him to anticipate and profit from the 2008 bubble. All these experiences urged the author to look to the past for similar situations to learn how to handle the future well. Dalio said, "There were 3 big things that hadn't happened in my lifetime, which prompted me to do this study. First, countries didn't have enough money to pay their debts even after lowering interest rates to 0, so their central banks began printing lots of money. Second, big eternal conflicts emerged due to growing gaps in wealth and values. This showed up in political populism and polarization between the left, who want to redistribute wealth, and the right, who want to defend those holding the wealth. And third, increasing external conflict between a rising great power and the leading great power, as is now happening with China and the United States. So I looked back. I saw that all these 3 things happened before, many times, and nearly always led to changing domestic and world orders. The last time this happened was from 1930 to 1945. What exactly is an order, you might ask? It's a governing system for people dealing with each other. There are internal orders for governing within countries, typically laid out in constitutions, and there is a world order for governing between countries, typically laid out in treaties. Internal orders change at different times than world orders. Orders within or between countries typically change after wars. Civil wars within countries, international wars between countries. They happen when revolutionary new forces defeat weak old orders. For example, the U.S. internal order was laid out in the Constitution in 1789 after the American Revolution, and it is still operating today even after the American Civil War. Russia got rid of its old order and established a new one with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended in 1991 with a relatively bloodless revolution. China began its current internal order in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War. You get the idea. The current world order, commonly called the American World Order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant world power. It was set out in agreements and treaties for how global governance and monetary systems would work. In 1944, the New World Monetary System was laid out in the Bretton Woods Agreement and established the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that is commonly accepted around the world, and having one is a key factor in a country becoming the richest and most powerful empire. With a new dominant power, a new world order begins. These changes take place in a timeless and universal cycle that I call the Big Cycle. Dalio studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. The rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and its currency called the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the United States Empire and the dollar, the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires. The rise and fall of all these empires happened in a quite similar way. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country or an empire that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishing the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich and the poor. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order and the cycle begins again. If you look back to history, you can easily see that this big cycle that I just described repeats and even goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. Just like empires, humans also go through cycles such as birth, maturity, weakness, and inevitable death. Human life cycles aren't exactly the same. Even if we know that the average human lives, let's say, up to 80 years, some people end up living much shorter and some live longer. While age is a good indicator to understand in which cycle the person is and when he will die, but a much better way is to look at health indicators. By looking at the person's health indicators, diet, and exercise, you can give quite good predictions. The same thing can be done with empires. Dalio said that by watching the vital indicators, he was able to see what stage a country was in, which helped him to anticipate what was likely to come next. Now give me a few minutes and I'll show you the last 500 years of history and show you the similar patterns across the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese empires. 500 years of big cycles. I'm going to describe the typical cycle by dividing it into 3 phases: the rise, the top, and the decline. The rise. The rise typically starts when powerful revolutionary leaders do 4 things. First, they win power by gaining more support than the opposition. Second, they consolidate power by converting, weakening, or eliminating the opposition, so no one can stand in their way. Third, they establish systems and institutions that make the country work well. And fourth, they pick their successors well or create systems that do that, because a great empire requires many great leaders over several generations. At this stage, soon after winning the fight, there is typically a period of peace and growing prosperity, because the leadership is clearly dominant and has broad support, so no one wants to fight it. During this phase, leaders within the country have to design an excellent system to raise the country's wealth and power. First and foremost, to be great, they must have a strong education, which is not just teaching knowledge and skills, but also strong character, civility, and work ethic. These are typically taught in the family, schools, and religious institutions. That provides a healthy respect for rules and laws, order within society, low corruption, and enables them to unite behind a common purpose and work well together. If they do this, they increasingly shift from producing basic products to innovating and inventing new technologies. For example, the Dutch rose to defeat the Habsburg Empire to become superbly educated. They became so inventive that they came up with a quarter of all major inventions in the world, the most important of which was the invention of ships that could travel around the world to collect great riches, and the invention of capitalism as we know it today to finance those voyages. As a result of all the above I described, the people in the country become more productive and more competitive in world markets, which shows up in their trading economic output and rising share of world trade. You can see this happening now as the US and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education infrastructure, research, and development. In all these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach. To develop productive entrepreneurs, even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used the form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice." And, "It's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets and, most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development. The Dutch created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock market to fund it. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were in power. London when the British were on top, New York is now, and China is quickly developing its financial centers. In order to succeed, most importantly, the capitalists, the governments, and the military must work together. For example, the Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government business and military operations. The U.S. military industrial complex followed the same, as does the Chinese system today. As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save it in making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade. The pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the US led. Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency. Having a reserve currency enables the empire to borrow more than other countries. That advantage is huge. Think about it. People all over the world are eager to save and hence lend back their currency to the empire. Countries without a reserve currency don't have that, and when the empire runs out of its own money, they can always print more. Just like the United States did in 1971, remember? The exorbitant privilege afforded by the empire's reserve currency leads borrowing to increase in the beginning of a financial bubble. All the empires that became the most powerful in the world followed this path to the top. When people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, it becomes more expensive to hire them, which means they are less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders, so they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become richer, they tend not to work hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top, from those who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it. They become accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenges. The golden era of the Dutch Empire and the Victorian era of the British Empire were such high prosperity periods like this. As people get used to doing things well, they increasingly bet on the good times continuing and borrow money to do that, which grows into financial bubbles. Naturally, the financial gains come unevenly, so the wealth gap grows. Wealth gaps are self-reinforcing because rich people use their greater resources to reinforce their powers. For example, they give greater privileges to their children, like better education, and they influence the political system to their advantage. This causes the gaps to grow between the rich and the poor. Those who are less well off feel the system is unfair, so resentments grow. But as long as the living standards of most people are still rising, these gaps and resentments don't boil over into conflict. Having the world's reserve currency inevitably leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. While this boosts spending power over the short term, it weakens the country's financial health and weakens the currency over the long term. In other words, when borrowing and spending are strong, the empire appears very strong. But its finances are in fact being weakened. The borrowing sustains the country's power and its military. Inevitably, the cost of maintaining and defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in. So having an empire becomes unprofitable. For example, the Dutch Empire overextended around the world and fought war after increasingly expensive war with the British and other European powers to protect its territory and trade routes. The British Empire similarly became massively bureaucratic and lost its competitive advantages. The U.S. has spent about $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences since September 11, 2001. And trillions more for other military operations and for supporting military bases in 70 countries. And it still isn't spending enough to support its military competition with China in the area around China. In this cycle, the richer countries eventually get deeper into debt by borrowing from poorer countries that save more. It's one of the early signs of a wealth and power shift. This started in the United States in the 1980s when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's, but started borrowing from Chinese who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Similarly, the British borrowed a lot of money from its much poorer colonies, and the Dutch did the same at their top. If the empire begins to run out of new lenders, those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out, and the strength of the empire begins to dwindle. The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting, or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money. At first gradually, and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought by excess spending and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its excess spending and its debts from the two world wars. And for the US, it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. When the government has problems funding itself, when there are bad economic conditions and living standards for most people are declining and there are large wealth and political gaps, internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups greatly increases. This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich. Typically, during such times, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear their wealth and well-being will be taken away, they move to places, to assets, and currencies they feel safer in. This process reduces the empire's tax revenue. When the outflow of wealth gets bad enough, governments ban it, and those seeking to get out begin to panic. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economy and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and restore order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. And it is when the move to a strong populist leader most likely happens. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes. This can be peaceful and maintain the existing order, but it's more often violent. For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained with existing internal order, while the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution were much more violent and led to new internal orders. This internal conflict makes the empire weak and vulnerable to rising external rivals who see this domestic weakness and are tempted to challenge the empire. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. Defending oneself and one's empire against rivals requires great military spending, which the empire can't afford, mainly because domestic economic conditions are deteriorating within the empire. Since there is no viable system for peacefully adjudicating international disputes, these conflicts are typically resolved through tests of power. As bigger and bolder challenges are made, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome, but retreating is bad too, because it signals that the empire is weak to those countries that are considering which side to be on. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce tectonic shifts. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and brought the end of the empire. For the British, this happened after World War II, when, despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing and weakened the British pound. the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order. Right now, the United States hasn't yet reached this point. While it has massive debt, it spends more than it earns and funds this deficit with more borrowing and printing huge amounts of new money. The big sell-off in dollars hasn't yet begun, and while there are great internal and external conflicts occurring for all the classic reasons, they've not yet crossed the line to become wars. Eventually, out of these conflicts, whether they're violent or not, come new winners who get together and restructure the losers' debts and political systems and establish the new world order. Then, the old cycle and empire ends, and the new one begins. And they do it all over again. Of course, not all of them transpire in exactly this way, but most largely do so much, so that it seems like the stories of rises and declines stays essentially the same. And the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use. So where are we heading now? The future. Most empires' decline is inevitable. Reversing a decline is difficult because that requires undoing a lot that's already been done, but it is possible. By looking at the health indicators of the empire, it's pretty easy to see which stage of the big cycle an empire is in, how fit it is, and whether its condition is improving or worsening, which can help one estimate how many years it has left. Still, these estimates aren't precise, and the cycle can be extended if those in charge pay attention to their vital signs and improve them. For example, knowing that a person is 60 years old, how fit they are, whether they smoke or not, and a few other basic vital signs, one can estimate the person's longevity. We can do that with empires and their vital signs too. It won't be precise, but it will provide quite a good idea about the longevity of the empire. It's most often the case that a nation's greatest war is with itself over whether or not it can make the hard decisions needed to sustain success. What we need to do as individuals comes down to just two things: earn more than we spend and treat each other well. All other things I mentioned, strong education, inventiveness, being competitive, and all the rest, are just ways of getting at these two things. It's easy to measure if we're doing them. So like people who want to get fit, let's get on the program and improve our vital signs. Let's do that individually and collectively. This video is created based on Ray Dalio's new book and video series called New World Order. I'll put links into the description to both the book and to the original video. If you enjoyed the video, check out one of the videos you now see on the screen. Thanks for watching.